When a strong-willed mail-order bride is cruelly rejected for her muscular build, she finds unexpected salvation at a neighboring cattle ranch where her physical strength becomes her greatest asset instead of her shame. Can a woman deemed too masculine for marriage discover that true love doesn't measure worth by society's narrow standards? The whistle of the train screamed through the Montana air as Margaret Foster gripped her small locket, the only piece of home she had left. Blood rushed in her ears, drowning out the hiss of steam. Today was the day she would meet her future husband. 32 years she'd waited, watching younger girls marry while she stayed behind to care for her ailing parents until they passed. Now she stood alone on the edge of a new life, her ticket bought with the last of her inheritance. Willow Creek Station. Last stop before Butte City, the conductor bellowed, jerking Margaret from her thoughts. Her legs wobbled as she stepped down onto the wooden platform. The October wind bit through her coat, making her glad of her sturdy build that had always kept her warm through Pennsylvania winters. A letter crinkled in her pocket, 3 months of hopeful writing with Mr. Edward Thornhill, who promised a comfortable home for a respectable lady willing to bring Eastern refinement to Montana territory. Margaret pulled back her shoulders and lifted her chin. The farm work that had built her strong arms and broad back was behind her now. Here she would be a rancher's wife. You the mail-order bride? A boy no more than 12 appeared at her elbow, freckles scattered across his sunburned face. I'm Miss Foster, she corrected gently. I've come to meet Mr. Thornhill. The boy's eyes widened as he looked her up and down. Gee, you're big as my pa. He pointed toward a tall figure at the end of the platform. That's Mr. Thornhill there, ma'am. Told me to fetch his lady when the train arrived. Margaret's stomach tightened at the boy's words. She'd never been called big with such surprise before, though she knew she stood taller than most women. A quick glance at her reflection in the station window showed wisps of brown hair escaping her neat bun, her cheeks flushed from travel. She pinched them for extra color and straightened her plain blue dress before walking toward her future. Edward Thornhill stood apart from the small crowd, his dark suit marking him as a man of means in this rough town. His clean-shaven face and carefully combed hair spoke of attention to appearance that matched his letters. But as Margaret approached, she watched his expression shift from anticipation to something that made her heart sink, shock, followed quickly by disappointment. Miss Foster? He asked, his voice tight with disbelief. Yes, sir. I've come as we arranged. She extended her hand, noticing how small and delicate his looked compared to her work-roughened palm. He hesitated before taking it, his handshake brief and cool. You're taller than I expected. 5'9", she said with an attempt at a smile. Tall enough to reach the top shelves without a stool. Her small joke fell flat in the awkward silence. Edward signaled to a porter to collect her trunk, then led her to a handsome buggy without offering his arm. It's 10 miles to the ranch, he said stiffly as he helped her up. We should arrive before dark. The ride stretched in uncomfortable silence. Margaret tried to start conversation 3 times, asking about his cattle operation, the town, and the coming winter, but Edward's answers grew increasingly short. Is something wrong, Mr. Thornhill? She finally asked as they passed a small creek, sunlight glinting off the water like scattered coins. No, he said too quickly. Then, your letters didn't mention your physical attributes. Margaret's face warmed. I don't understand. You said you worked on a family farm, he continued, keeping his eyes on the road. But you didn't specify the nature of your labor. My father had no sons, she explained. I helped with everything, plowing, harvesting, caring for livestock. I see. The words fell between them like stones. As the road climbed a gentle hill, a sprawling ranch appeared. A large white house stood proudly at its center, surrounded by barns, corrals, and vast green pastures dotted with cattle. In the distance, mountains rose against the sky like guardians. It's beautiful, Margaret breathed, momentarily forgetting her unease. Thornhill Ranch is the finest property in the county, Edward said, the first hint of warmth entering his voice. 15,000 acres and growing. I supply beef to mining operations across 3 territories. A tall man emerged from one of the barns as they approached, leading a magnificent black horse. His weathered face and simple clothes marked him as a worker, but something in his confident stride suggested authority. "That's Blackwood," Edward said, his tone cooling again. "Manages the neighboring ranch. Always seems to be around when not wanted." As the buggy passed, the man named Blackwood touched his hat brim in greeting, his eyes meeting Margaret's for a brief moment. Unlike Edward's gaze, his held no judgment, just simple curiosity. Margaret felt a strange flutter in her chest as they continued toward the house. The sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the land that would become her home, if Edward Thornhill could look past what was clearly disappointing him. "We'll have supper," Edward announced as they pulled up to the house, "then discuss our arrangement." The way he said arrangement sent a chill through Margaret that had nothing to do with the evening air. She followed him up the porch steps, aware of her heavy footfalls on the wooden boards, suddenly conscious of every inch of her strong, capable body that had served her well for 32 years but now felt like a betrayal. A china teacup shattered against the wooden floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot through Edward Thornhill's elegant dining room. Margaret froze, her hands still reaching for the fallen cup, aware of every pair of eyes boring into her. "I'm terribly sorry," she whispered, already kneeling to gather the broken pieces. "Leave it," Edward snapped, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Martha will clean it." The dinner party, arranged hastily by Edward to introduce his mail-order bride to Willow Creek's finest families, had been a disaster from the moment Margaret descended the staircase in her best dress. Too tight across the shoulders, it made her uncomfortably aware of her muscular frame compared to the dainty women who tittered behind their fans. Now, as she rose from the floor with fragments of china clutched in her palm, Mrs. Hollister, the banker's wife, leaned toward her companion and whispered something that made both women glance at Margaret's hands and giggle. "Perhaps Miss Foster should share how she developed such impressive strength," suggested Mr. Hollister, swirling brandy in his glass. "One might mistake you for one of the ranch hands, my dear." Margaret's face burned. "My father's farm required everyone's help, sir. There was no task too humble or difficult." "How rustic," Mrs. Hollister replied, her smile not reaching her eyes. Edward cleared his throat. "Ladies, gentlemen, shall we retire to the parlor? I believe Martha has prepared coffee." The guests filed out, leaving Margaret alone with the broken teacup and her shattered hopes. Through the window, she could see a rider approaching the man Edward had identified as Blackwood. He dismounted with easy grace, his movements speaking of a lifetime in the saddle. "Miss Foster," Edward's voice startled her. She hadn't heard him return. "My study. Now." She followed him down the hallway, past framed photographs showing Edward with various important-looking men beside freshly built railroads and mining operations. His study smelled of leather and tobacco, masculine and intimidating. "This won't work," Edward said the moment the door closed. He didn't invite her to sit. "The advertisement clearly stated I sought a refined, delicate woman to bring civility to my household." Margaret swallowed hard. "Your letters mentioned nothing about physical requirements, Mr. Thornhill." "I shouldn't have had to spell it out," he replied, gesturing toward her body with undisguised distaste. "Look at yourself, hands like a farmhand, shoulders like a man's. How would my business associates respect me if I married a woman who could likely outwork my ranch hands?" A silver letter opener on his desk caught the lamplight, its edge gleaming sharp as the pain slicing through Margaret's chest. "I traveled 2,000 miles, she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I sold everything I owned. And I apologize for the misunderstanding." Edward's tone suggested it was entirely her fault. He reached into a drawer, withdrew an envelope, and placed it on the desk between them. "Train fare back east, plus a modest sum for your inconvenience. I've arranged for you to stay at the Widow Carson's boarding house until the next eastbound train." Margaret stared at the envelope, her mind racing. Back east to what? The farm was sold, her parents gone. Her small hometown would buzz with gossip about Margaret Foster, too mannish to secure a husband even by mail. "You can't just discard me like unwanted baggage," she said, surprising herself with her boldness. Edward's expression hardened. "I require a wife, Miss Foster, not a workhorse. A woman my peers' wives can befriend, not one they whisper about behind their handkerchiefs." A knock at the study door interrupted them. Martha, the housekeeper, poked her head in, looking uncomfortable. "Beggin' your pardon, Mr. Thornhill, but Mr. Blackwood is here about that business with the water rights." Edward's mouth tightened with annoyance. "Tell him this is a highly inappropriate time. He says the matter can't wait, sir. Something about your men blocking the creek again." Edward exhaled sharply. "Fine. Show him to the front parlor. I'll be there momentarily." After Martha left, he turned back to Margaret. "We're finished here. Please have your things ready by morning. I'll send a wagon for you and your trunk." As Margaret's fingers closed around the envelope, a wave of humiliation washed over her, hot and suffocating. Through the study window, she could see the man called Blackwood waiting on the porch, hat in hand. Something in his patient posture, so different from Edward's rigid formality, caught her attention. "I'll have Martha show you to your room," Edward said, already adjusting his tie in preparation for his visitor. "Consider yourself fortunate, Miss Foster. Some men might have expected compensation for their trouble before sending you away." The crude implication struck Margaret like a physical blow. She drew herself up to her full height, suddenly glad of every inch and every muscle earned through years of honest labor. "I pity your future bride, Mr. Thornhill," she said quietly. "She'll need delicate shoulders indeed to bear the weight of your pride." She turned and walked out, her steps measured and dignified despite the trembling in her knees. In the hallway, she nearly collided with Blackwood, who stepped aside with a small nod. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and respectful. Margaret nodded back, unable to trust her voice. As she climbed the stairs to pack her meager belongings, she heard Edward's voice rising from below, something about property lines and water access. The business of men who owned land and made decisions. Men who could dismiss a woman's entire future with a single envelope. In her room, Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed tears to fall. Not for the loss of Edward Thornhill. A day's acquaintance had shown him to be far from the thoughtful gentleman of his letters, but for her own foolishness. For believing that a woman like her could find acceptance in a world that valued women for their delicacy rather than their strength. Outside, darkness fell over the Montana landscape. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes began their nightly chorus. Margaret wiped her eyes and began to fold her clothes with practical efficiency. Tomorrow she would go to Mrs. Carson's boarding house with her head held high. What came after that, she had no idea. A plate crashed downstairs, jolting Margaret from her tearful trance. 3 hours of crying had left her eyes puffy and her throat raw. The tiny boarding house room felt like a cage, so different from the vast ranch she'd pictured sharing with Edward Thornhill. Margaret splashed cold water on her face and squared her shoulders. She wouldn't let anyone see her broken. "You got yourself here, you'll get yourself out," she whispered to her reflection. The words her father taught her when farm troubles hit. Her strong jawline, so like his, stared back at her. Through the thin walls, 2 women gossiped in the hallway. "Poor thing got sent away before she even unpacked her trunk," one whispered. "Thornhill took one look at those farm muscles and near ran for the hills," the other replied with a snicker. Margaret's hands curled into fists. 2,000 miles from home, not a friend in sight, and less than $20 to her name once she paid Mrs. Carson for the room. What choices did she have? Return east in shame? Seek work as a maid in town where everyone already whispered about her? A knock at the door rescued her from spiraling thoughts. "Miss Foster?" "Mrs. Carson says supper's ready," called a young voice. Downstairs, the boarding house dining room buzzed with curious glances. 6 other boarders, 3 traveling salesmen, an elderly widow, and a schoolteacher with her young daughter, all found reasons to study their plates when Margaret entered. "Don't mind them," Mrs. Carson murmured, placing a bowl of stew before her. Folks round here got nothing better to do than mind others' business. Margaret merely nodded, focusing on the first real meal she'd had since stepping off the train. The savory broth warmed her empty stomach. Half finished with her meal, the front door banged open, bringing a gust of wind and the scent of horses. Conversations hushed as heavy boots thumped across the foyer floor. "Evening, Mrs. Carson," called a deep voice. "Hope I'm not too late for some of that famous stew." A tall man with sun-weathered skin ducked slightly to enter the dining room. Dust covered his denim pants and leather vest. His dark hair, streaked with early silver at the temples, curled damply at his collar as if he'd hastily washed before arriving. "James Blackwood." Mrs. Carson brightened. "Always room for you. Take a seat while I fetch a bowl." The stranger's gaze swept the room, pausing momentarily on Margaret. Recognition flickered in his eyes. Had he seen her arrive with Edward? But he offered nothing more than a polite nod before settling at the far end of the table. Only after the apple pie was served did Mrs. Carson make introductions. "Mr. Blackwood, this here's Miss Foster, just arrived from Pennsylvania." "Ma'am," he acknowledged with a slight tip of his head. "Mr. Blackwood owns the Doubleby Ranch," Mrs. Carson continued. "Borders Thornhill's place to the north." Margaret stiffened at Edward's name. "I believe I saw you riding with Thornhill earlier today," Blackwood said casually. The room fell silent, all ears straining for gossip. "I was," Margaret answered evenly, chin lifting. Briefly. Something in her tone must have communicated the rest, because Blackwood simply nodded and changed the subject, asking the traveling button salesman about conditions on the Eastern Road. Later, as boarders dispersed to evening activities, Margaret lingered in the parlor, staring out at the darkening mountains. The enormity of her situation pressed down like a physical weight. Every penny spent here was one less for her journey back to nothing. "Miss Foster." She turned to find James Blackwood standing in the doorway, hat in hands. "Might I have a word?" Margaret nodded warily. "Mrs. Carson mentioned you're familiar with dairy cattle." "My father's farm. 28 head of Holstein Friesians," she replied, surprised at the topic. "Got myself in a bind," he said. "My foreman broke his leg yesterday. Bad timing with the fall drive coming. I need capable hands." Margaret's brow furrowed. "Surely you haven't come to ask me." "That's exactly what I've come to ask. Fair wages for honest work." "Women don't work cattle drives, Mr. Blackwood." A half-smile creased his weathered face. "My ranch, my rules, Miss Foster, and I judge people by what they can do, not what they look like doing it." The clock on the mantel ticked loudly in the silence that followed. "It's temporary," he continued, "until you decide your next step. But it'll put money in your pocket and honest food in your belly." Margaret studied him, searching for mockery or worse, pity. She found neither. "Your men won't accept a woman working alongside them," she said, testing him. "My men follow my lead or find employment elsewhere." The steel in his voice left no doubt he meant it. "Besides, most of them started as greenhorns too. You'll be in good company." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Storm coming. Much like the storm of protests sure to follow if she accepted his offer. A respectable woman didn't take men's work, didn't live among ranch hands, didn't reject the safety of proper society. Yet what had proper society offered her but humiliation? "When would I start?" she heard herself asking. "Tomorrow, 6 o'clock sharp. I'll send a wagon." Margaret squared her shoulders. "I'll be ready at 5:30. Blackwood extended his hand. When Margaret grasped it, she didn't bother to soften her grip as she had with Edward. Blackwood's handshake matched her firmness, his calloused palm pressing against hers without hesitation. "Welcome to the Doubleby, Miss Foster," he said. "Pack for dirt and weather. Pretty has no place on a working ranch." As he turned to leave, Margaret caught Mrs. Carson watching from the hallway, an unreadable expression on her face. "You sure about this, Miss Foster?" the older woman asked once Blackwood had gone. "It's unusual work for a lady." Margaret looked down at her hands. Strong hands that could milk cows before dawn, deliver calves at midnight, and mend fence in driving snow. Hands Edward Thornhill had found too rough and mannish. I stopped being a lady the moment I stepped off that train, Mrs. Carson, Margaret replied. Now I'm just a woman who needs to eat. In her room that night, Margaret unpacked her trunk. She laid aside her good dress, the one she'd planned to marry in, and instead prepared her sturdiest skirts and blouses. At the bottom of the trunk lay her father's old wool pants and flannel shirt, packed on impulse before leaving home. She held them against her chest, remembering how he'd taught her every aspect of running the farm, never once saying certain tasks weren't meant for daughters. You were right, Papa, she whispered into the darkness. City folk have strange ideas about what makes a woman valuable. Dawn would come early, bringing with it an uncharted path. Not the one she'd traveled 2,000 miles to walk, but perhaps, just perhaps, one that would lead somewhere worth going. Blood trickled down Margaret's palm where the rope had burned through her glove. 3 weeks at the Doubleby Ranch had toughened her hands, but not enough for today's challenge. A stubborn calf stuck in mud up to its chest, bawling pitifully for its mother. She'll die if we don't pull her out soon, shouted Hank, the oldest ranch hand, as rain began pelting them. Ground's getting softer by the minute. Lightning cracked across the darkening sky. Men and Margaret formed a line on the rope. Boots slipping in mud turned slick as soap. Thunder rolled as if the heavens themselves were laughing at their efforts. Pull, James Blackwood commanded, his voice cutting through the storm. Margaret dug her heels into the earth, felt her shoulder muscles strain as they all heaved in unison. The calf moved an inch, then stuck fast again, its frightened eyes rolling white. It's no use, panted Miguel, the youngest cowhand. We need the horses. No time, James argued. Ground'll swallow her whole before we get back. Margaret released the rope, ignoring the men's confused looks. Without a word, she sloshed through ankle-deep mud to the calf's side. What in tarnation are you doing, woman? Hank hollered. She ignored him, studying the way the calf was positioned. Its front legs were splayed, creating suction in the mud. Rather than fighting the physics, she needed to work with it. Mr. Blackwood, she called over the rain. When I give the signal, have everyone pull straight up before back. James nodded, no questions asked. A small gesture of trust that meant more than he could know. Margaret knelt beside the terrified animal, mud soaking her split riding skirt. Easy, little one, she murmured, slipping her arms under the calf's belly. With a deep breath, she braced her legs and lifted, her strong arms trembling with effort. Now, she shouted. The men heaved upward. For one breathless moment, nothing happened. Then the suction broke with a wet slurp, and the calf lurched free, sending Margaret sprawling backward into the mud. Cheers broke out as the men dragged the calf to solid ground. Margaret lay there catching her breath, rain washing mud from her face, until a hand appeared before her. That was something else, Miss Foster, James said, helping her up. His eyes held something new, respect tinged with wonder. Back at the ranch, Cook banished them all to the washhouse before allowing them near his clean kitchen. The men, usually careful to give Margaret privacy, were too hungry and tired for such niceties today. No peeking, boys, or I'll feed your eyes to the hogs, Hank warned as Margaret scrubbed behind a threadbare curtain. The gruff protection touched her more than any flowery compliment. Later, huddled around the blazing cookhouse stove, they passed steaming bowls of stew and fresh bread. For the first time, Margaret found herself included in the easy banter. Never seen a woman with arms like yours, Miguel commented between bites. My mama would faint dead away. My mother could carry a full-grown lamb under each arm, Margaret replied. Strength runs in the women of my family. Lucky for that calf today, James said from the head of the table. Hank raised his coffee cup. To Miss Foster, who saved us $20 of prime beef. The men thumped the table in agreement. Something warm bloomed in Margaret's chest that had nothing to do with the stove's heat. After dinner, as others drifted toward the bunkhouse, James beckoned Margaret to his small office off the main house. How's the hand? He asked, nodding toward her bandaged palm. I've had worse from churning butter, she answered honestly. He smiled, reaching for a ledger. First payday tomorrow. Wanted to make sure I got your wages right. Margaret tensed. Would he pay her less than the men, despite her equal work? James pushed the open book toward her. There, next to her name, was the same amount listed for all the hands. That satisfactory? He asked. Margaret nodded, throat suddenly tight. More than fair. Also, he continued, wanted to ask if you'd consider staying beyond the month we agreed. Fall roundup's coming, and you've proven yourself 10 times over. Hope and caution battled in her heart. The men seemed to have accepted me, but town's a different matter. Saw how folks stared when we rode in for supplies yesterday. James leaned back in his chair. Truth is, Miss Foster, I've been meaning to ask about that. Would be easier if you'd consider different attire. Her face must have shown her alarm because he quickly added, men's trousers, those split skirts catch on everything, and after today's mud bath. Margaret blinked in surprise. You want me to dress as a man? Want you to dress practical, he corrected. Don't give a damn what's underneath as long as you can do the work. A startled laugh escaped her. In Pennsylvania, suggesting a woman wear trousers would be scandalous. Here it was merely sensible. I have my father's old work clothes, she admitted. Packed them before leaving home. Problem solved, then. He closed the ledger. And about town gossip. Folks got nothing better to do than wag their tongues. Let them. Double B's the most profitable spread in the county. They can talk all they want while counting the money I put in the bank. Before she could respond, a commotion erupted outside. They rushed to the porch to find Miguel struggling to control a magnificent black stallion that reared and kicked against its lead rope. What in blazes? James demanded. Delivery from the Carlson place, Miguel explained, dancing backward as hooves slashed air inches from his chest. Said you'd know what it was about. James's face darkened. Damn fool. I told him that horse was too green to sell. The stallion's wild eyes rolled as it fought the rope. Margaret could see the animal's fear, not aggression, but pure terror. Hold him steady, she said, stepping forward. Miss Foster, don't. James began, but she was already moving slowly toward the trembling horse, hands open at her sides. Hey there, beautiful, she murmured, keeping her voice low and even. Nobody's going to hurt you. The stallion snorted, pawing the ground but no longer rearing. Margaret continued her approach, remembering her father's lessons about frightened animals. Never show fear. Move with purpose but without threat. When she was 3 feet away, she stopped and simply stood, letting the horse decide the next move. Minutes stretched as rain dripped from the porch eaves. Finally, the stallion extended its muzzle, nostrils flaring as it caught her scent. Margaret didn't move, didn't reach, just waited. The horse took 1 step forward, then another, until warm breath gusted against her palm. There you are, she whispered. Just needed someone to listen, didn't you? Gradually, she raised her hand to stroke the damp neck. The stallion trembled but allowed her touch. I'll be damned, Hank muttered from the porch. Margaret untied the lead rope from Miguel's white-knuckled grip and gently walked the horse toward the corral. The animal followed with only occasional nervous sidesteps. James fell in beside her, keeping a cautious distance from the stallion. Where'd you learn to do that? My father, she answered. He said animals know truth from lies. If you're scared, they know. If you mean harm, they know that too. Once the stallion was safely corralled with fresh water and hay, Margaret turned to find the entire ranch crew watching her with expressions ranging from disbelief to outright admiration. Thornhill's a bigger fool than I thought, James said quietly, for her ears alone. 2 days later, Margaret rode into town beside James, wearing her father's old trousers altered to fit her frame. They needed supplies, and Margaret needed to cash her first paycheck. Whispers followed them down the main street, some townspeople openly staring at the woman dressed in men's clothing atop a fine mare. Outside the general store, they encountered Edward Thornhill escorting a tiny, pale-haired woman who must be his new bride. Edward's eyes widened in shock at Margaret's appearance. "Miss Foster," he managed stiffly. "I hardly recognized you." "Mr. Thornhill," she acknowledged with a small nod. "Ma'am." The petite woman offered a timid smile, her gaze darting curiously between Margaret and James. "I see you found employment," Edward said, emphasizing the word as if it were distasteful. "Miss Foster is my best hand," James replied before Margaret could speak. "Got away with horses even my most seasoned men can't match." The color that rose in Edward's face told Margaret he took this as a personal insult. "How fortunate," he said tightly. "Come, Caroline, we shouldn't keep Dr. Miller waiting." As they walked away, Margaret heard Edward mutter, "Disgraceful display. A woman in trousers, working with common cowhands." James's hand settled briefly on her shoulder. "Pay him no mind. Man wouldn't know value if it trampled his fancy boots." That evening in the cookhouse, the atmosphere was unusually charged. Word had spread about the encounter in town, and the men seemed personally offended on Margaret's behalf. "Heard Thornhill's new bride fainted dead away first time she saw a calf being born," Miguel reported gleefully. "Had to be carried back to the house like a sack of grain." Margaret concentrated on her stew, uncomfortable being the center of such talk, even if it favored her. "Speaking of calves," James interrupted, "roundup starts Monday. Margaret, you'll ride with Hank's team on the north section. Your way with skittish stock will come in handy." The casual inclusion, her name and team in the same breath, settled something deep in Margaret's chest. Here, her strength wasn't something to hide or minimize. Here, the very qualities Edward had rejected made her valuable. Later, checking on the black stallion under a star-filled sky, Margaret leaned against the corral fence and breathed in the scent of sage and pine. The mountains loomed dark against the horizon, ancient and enduring. "We're both finding our way, aren't we?" she murmured to the stallion, who nickered softly in response. "Both learning where we belong." And for the first time since stepping off that train, Margaret Foster felt the ground solid beneath her feet. Whispers followed Margaret like hungry wolves as she stepped through the doorway of Willow Creek's town hall. The harvest dance was in full swing, fiddles crying out merry tunes while dancers twirled beneath paper lanterns and autumn leaves. Her heart hammered against her ribs, louder than the boot stomps on the wooden floor. "They're all staring," she whispered, clutching James's arm tighter. The borrowed blue dress felt strange after months in work clothes, the fabric soft where canvas would normally scratch. James Blackwood stood tall beside her, his usual cowboy hat absent, hair slicked back with pomade. "Let them look," he said, voice steady as a mountain stream. "They're staring at the strongest woman in Montana territory." Margaret swallowed hard, scanning the crowded room. 3 months had changed her. Skin tanned dark as saddle leather, arms defined with muscle from wrangling cattle and hefting hay bales. The town ladies with their powdered faces and cinched waists gathered in corners, pointed fingers half hidden behind fluttering fans. "Miss Foster actually rides with the men," one woman's stage whispered loud enough to carry. "Can you imagine? I heard she can rope a steer faster than Blackwood's foreman," another added, scandalized. James touched the small of her back, gentle as he'd been with the newborn foal last week. "Dance with me," he said. Not a question but a lifeline thrown in churning waters. He guided her toward the center of the floor, where couples spun in circles like maple seeds in autumn wind. His hand found her waist, strong and sure. Margaret placed her palm against his shoulder, remembering how they'd stood side by side to push a stuck wagon out of creek mud just yesterday. "I don't know the steps," she admitted, watching feet move in patterns around them. "Just follow me," James said with a smile that crinkled the sun lines around his eyes. Like crossing the north pasture, one step at a time. They moved awkwardly at first, her feet heavy as if still in work boots. But James led patiently, his body telegraphing each turn before it came. Slowly, the stairs faded from Margaret's awareness, replaced by the simple joy of movement, of being held not too tight and not too loose, just right. "You're a natural," James murmured as she matched his rhythm. Something warm bloomed in her chest, different from the burn of hard work or the sting of old rejection. As they turned near the refreshment table, a cold voice cut through their moment like a knife through butter. Well, if it isn't the farmhand bride. Edward Thornhill stood before them, impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than a month of ranch wages. Beside him stood a tiny woman with skin pale as milk, fingers like bird bones clutching his arm. Her eyes darted nervously, never settling on any one thing. "Mr. Thornhill," Margaret acknowledged, straightening her spine. "Mrs. Thornhill," she added with a nod to the woman who'd taken her intended place. "Miss Foster," Edward replied, his gaze traveling over her with undisguised disapproval. "I see Blackwood has put you to work. How progressive of him." The music seemed to fade, dancers sliding away like water parting around stones in a creek bed. James's hand tightened on hers, but his voice remained calm. "Miss Foster has become indispensable to my operation," he said. "Some might call that good fortune." Edward sniffed. "Some might call it improper. A woman's place is in the home, not the fields." Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks, not from shame but anger. "And who decides that place, Mr. Thornhill? Men who need delicate ornaments to make themselves feel important." The timid Mrs. Thornhill's eyes widened, her lips parting in surprise. For just a moment, something like admiration flickered across her face. "Come, Caroline," Edward snapped, tugging his wife's arm. "We've greeted the couple sufficiently." As they turned away, Margaret called after them, voice steady. "Mrs. Thornhill, should you ever need assistance of any kind, the Blackwood Ranch welcomes visitors." Edward's back stiffened, but Caroline glanced over her shoulder with the ghost of a smile before being swept away into the crowd. "That was kindly done," James said, guiding Margaret back into the dance. "I recognize a caged bird when I see one," she replied. I was nearly in her shoes. They danced 3 more songs before Mrs. Carson, the boarding house owner, beckoned them to join her table. The older woman had become something of a friend to Margaret, teaching her to bake bread when ranch work allowed. "Causing quite a stir tonight, aren't you?" Mrs. Carson said, passing Margaret a cup of punch. "Half the women are horrified, half curious, and every unmarried girl is wondering if their future might hold more than darning socks." "I'm just dancing," Margaret protested. Mrs. Carson laughed. "No, dear. You're showing them another way to be a woman in this territory." Across the table, Sheriff Miller nodded in greeting. "Miss Foster, heard you helped Blackwood move that herd through Wolf Creek Pass. Tricky business, that." "We lost none," Margaret confirmed, pride warming her voice, "though we nearly lost Mr. Peterson when his horse spooked at a rattler." As conversation flowed around cattle prices and weather predictions, Margaret realized she was being included as an equal in the discussion. Not as a curiosity or scandal, but as someone with valuable opinions. When Sheriff Miller mentioned trouble brewing with cattle rustlers near the border, James frowned. "They hit the Pendleton place last week," the sheriff continued. "Took 20 head and left a ranch hand with a bullet in his shoulder." "We should organize a night watch," James suggested. "Rotate men between the ranches." "I could take shifts," Margaret offered without thinking. The table fell silent. Then Sheriff Miller nodded slowly. "Good eyes are good eyes, I reckon. Man or woman doesn't much matter when it comes to spotting trouble." Later, as they walked back toward the waiting wagon, James stopped beneath a cottonwood tree, its leaves golden in the lamplight spilling from the town hall windows. "You surprised me tonight," he said, turning to face her. "By offering to watch for rustlers?" Margaret asked. "By showing everyone exactly who you are without apology." His eyes searched her face. "Do you know how rare that is?" A cool breeze lifted loose strands of hair from her face. In the distance, a coyote called lonely to the rising moon. Margaret thought of Caroline Thornhill's sad eyes, of the stiff-backed town ladies, of her own mother who'd worked until her back bent like a bow but never spoke above a whisper. "I don't know how to be anyone else anymore," she admitted. James took her hand, his calloused thumb brushing over her equally work-roughened knuckles. "That's what I admire most," he said, voice dropped low. "When I fetched you from Mrs. Carson's that day, I needed help with cattle. Now I can't imagine the ranch without you." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither was quite ready to name. Margaret's heart beat fast as a startled rabbit's. She wondered if he could feel her pulse where their hands joined. "The ranch?" she repeated softly. "Or you?" His eyes widened, surprise giving way to something deeper. Before he could answer, the wagon driver called out, breaking the moment like thin ice cracking underfoot. "Best get moving if we want to beat the storm rolling in." Indeed, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, outlined in silver where moonlight caught their edges. James helped Margaret into the wagon, his touch lingering longer than necessary. As they rode back toward the Blackwood Ranch, lightning forked distant skies. Margaret sat beside James on the bench, their shoulders touching with each bump in the road. Neither spoke, but something had shifted between them, like the first deep crack that precedes an avalanche. The truth they both circled but hadn't yet spoken hung in the air. What had begun as convenience had grown roots neither had expected. And like the approaching storm, it couldn't be held back much longer. Gunshots cracked the pre-dawn silence, jerking Margaret from sleep. She threw off wool blankets and grabbed the rifle she kept beside her bed before she'd even fully opened her eyes. Her bare feet hit the cold floorboards as shouts erupted from the bunkhouse. "Rustlers! North pasture!" She yanked on boots and a coat over her nightgown, fingers fumbling with buttons in the dark. 2 weeks had passed since the harvest dance, and the warnings about cattle thieves had proven true. 3 neighboring ranches had been hit. The ranch yard churned with activity, men grabbing guns, saddling horses by lantern light. James stood in the center, shouting orders, his face grim in the fading moonlight. "Margaret!" he called when he spotted her. "Stay here. Guard the house and the south barn." She squared her shoulders. "I'm a better shot than Peterson or Williams." "That's why I need you here," he countered, swinging onto his stallion. "They might be trying to split our attention. Protect our horses. Without them, we're finished." Before she could argue further, he and 5 hands thundered away toward the north pasture, hoofbeats fading into darkness. The remaining men looked to her for direction. "Cooper, take the west fence line," she ordered, checking her rifle. "Jones, east side. Peterson, watch the main road." As they scattered to their posts, Margaret climbed to the hayloft, positioning herself at the window that overlooked both the ranch yard and the valuable horses below. From this height, she could see the first pink streaks of dawn touching the mountain peaks, though the valley remained shrouded in shadow. Minutes stretched like taffy. Margaret's finger rested beside the trigger, eyes scanning the property line. A flicker of movement caught her attention, not from the north where James had gone, but from the east creek bed, usually dry this time of year. 2 figures crept toward the barn, using the gnarled cottonwoods as cover. Margaret's heart jumped into her throat. James had been right. The gunshots were a trick to draw the men away while others stole the horses. She aimed carefully but held her fire, waiting until the thieves emerged from the trees. When they broke cover, running low toward the barn door, she called out clear as a church bell. "Stop right there or the next sound you'll hear is my bullet." One man froze. The other reached for his gun. Margaret fired a warning shot that kicked up dirt near his feet. "Next one won't miss. Do what she says," the first man hissed, raising his hands slowly. Margaret whistled sharp and loud. Cooper came running from his post, rifle ready. "We got 2 here," she called down. "Watch them while I check for more." She kept her position for another hour until James and the others returned, dusty and tired but victorious. They'd caught 3 rustlers by the north herd and recovered stolen cattle from the Pendleton ranch. "You were right," Margaret told James as they tied up the would-be horse thieves. "They wanted to split our forces." Pride flashed in his eyes. "And you were ready for them." Sheriff Miller arrived mid-morning to take the rustlers to jail. As he loaded them into his wagon, he tipped his hat to Margaret. 5 caught total," he announced. "Looks like we broke the back of this gang. Good shooting, Miss Foster. Might make a deputy of you yet." After the excitement died down, the ranch settled into the quiet rhythm of an ordinary day. But something had changed in how the men looked at Margaret. Respect had deepened into something like reverence. She'd not just worked alongside them now. She'd helped protect their livelihood. That evening, the first heavy snow of winter began to fall, thick flakes swirling from a pewter sky. James found Margaret in the barn, checking on a pregnant mare who was close to foaling. "You should rest," he said, joining her at the stall door. "Been a long day." "I promised Betty I'd stay with her," Margaret replied, nodding toward the mare who paced her stall restlessly. First foal's always the hardest. James leaned against the rough-hewn post, watching Margaret's gentle hands stroke the mare's neck. In the lantern light, her face showed no trace of the fierce woman who'd held rustlers at gunpoint that morning. Yet he knew that same strength lived just beneath the surface, ready when needed. "You saved the ranch today," he said quietly. Margaret shook her head. "I did what anyone would do to protect their home." "Their home?" he repeated, the words hanging between them like the steam of their breath in the cold barn. She looked up, suddenly aware of what she'd said. "I know what you meant." James moved closer, his shoulder brushing hers as they both leaned on the stall door. "And you're right. This is your home now, if you want it to be." Outside, the wind picked up, driving snow against the barn walls. Betty nickered softly, drawing their attention. "She's starting," Margaret said, recognizing the signs of early labor. "We'll need fresh straw and more lanterns." For the next 3 hours, they worked together in comfortable silence, helping the mare through her difficult delivery. When the foal finally emerged, a leggy, chestnut colt with a white star on his forehead, they shared a smile that needed no words. "Look at that," James murmured as the newborn struggled to stand on wobbly legs. "Determined little fellow. Takes after his mother," Margaret replied, watching Betty nuzzle her baby with obvious pride. After making sure mother and foal were settled, they stepped outside into a transformed world. Snow had blanketed the ranch in pristine white, softening every harsh edge and muffling every sound. Fat flakes still fell, catching in Margaret's hair and on her eyelashes. "Beautiful," she breathed, tilting her face to the sky. James watched her instead of the snow. "Yes," he agreed quietly. "Beautiful." They walked toward the main house, their boots crunching new paths across the yard. At the porch steps, James stopped, turning to face her. "I received a letter yesterday," he said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "From my sister in Boston." Margaret felt her stomach tighten. "Oh," she wrote asking about you. "News travels even to Boston." He brushed snow from his coat. "She says a woman of your abilities would be welcomed in the city. She could introduce you to society, help you find a position as a governess or companion to a wealthy family." Margaret stared at him, confusion and hurt blooming in her chest. "Are you trying to send me away?" "No." The word burst from him like a shot. "God, no. I'm trying." He ran a hand through his snow-dampened hair. "I'm trying to give you choices, Margaret. When you came to Montana, they were taken from you. Thornhill made your decision for you, and then I did the same by offering you work." "It wasn't the same," she said firmly. "Maybe not, but you deserve to choose your own path, not have it chosen for you." His eyes searched hers in the dim porch light. "My sister's offer is genuine. You could have a different life than this, easier, more comfortable." Margaret looked around at the snow-covered ranch, thinking of the day just past. The danger, yes, but also the triumph. The hard work, but also the satisfaction. The isolation, but also the camaraderie. "And if I choose to stay here?" Something shifted in James's expression, vulnerability replacing his usual quiet confidence. "Then I would ask you to stay not as my foreman or ranch hand, but as my wife." The words hung in the frigid air between them. Margaret's heart pounded so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. "Your wife?" she repeated, barely trusting her ears. James reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold band. "I've carried this for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment." He held it up, the metal catching the porch light. "Not because I need a workhorse or a good shot, though you're both those things, but because I've come to love the woman who can gentle a frightened colt and stand her ground against cattle thieves. The woman whose strength has become the backbone of this ranch, and of my life. Margaret stared at the ring, then at the face of the man holding it. James Blackwood, who had seen value in her when another saw only flaws, who had taught her to rope and ride, but never once suggested she be anything other than exactly who she was. In Pennsylvania, my father used to say I was too strong-willed, too capable for my own good, she said softly. He meant well, but he worried no man would want a wife who could plow a straighter furrow than he could. James chuckled. Your father never met a Montana rancher. No, she agreed with a smile. He didn't. She took a deep breath. I've never been one to hide my thoughts, James, so I'll speak plain now. I made my choice the day you offered me work instead of pity. I choose this land, this life. Her hand reached for his, steady despite the emotion making her voice tremble. And you. The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise on fresh snow, brilliant and transforming. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, a cry came from the barn, the new foal calling for its mother. Life doesn't wait, does it? Margaret said with a laugh. No, James agreed, his hand still holding hers. But we'll face whatever comes together. They walked back toward the barn hand in hand, their joined shadows stretching blue across the unmarked snow. Above them, the storm clouds parted, revealing a spray of stars across the Montana sky, countless possibilities shining down on the path they'd chosen together. Someone had hung white ribbons from every post and rafter of the barn. They danced like ghosts in the spring breeze that swept through the open doors, carrying the scent of new grass and wildflowers. Margaret stood hidden in the tack room, heart fluttering wilder than the ribbons. Through a crack in the door, she watched guests arrive. Ranch hands in pressed shirts, townspeople in Sunday best, even Sheriff Miller with his badge polished bright as a new penny. Nervous? Mrs. Carson asked, adjusting the simple veil in Margaret's hair. Not about marrying James, Margaret replied, smoothing the skirt of her cream-colored dress. Just about everyone watching. 6 months had passed since James had slipped his mother's ring on her finger. 6 months of planning between cattle drives and foaling season and the everyday work of ranch life. 6 months of whispers in town whenever Margaret visited. Some admiring, some still scandalized by the woman who'd traded side saddle for saddle horn. You faced down armed rustlers, Mrs. Carson reminded her with a smile. Surely you can face a few wedding guests. A knock at the door made both women turn. Caroline Thornhill stood in the doorway, looking like a bird ready to take flight at the slightest sound. Mrs. Thornhill, Margaret said, genuinely surprised. I didn't think you would come. Caroline stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. Her delicate face showed signs of strain, but her eyes were clear and determined. Edward is in Helena on business, she said quietly. He doesn't know I'm here. Margaret and Mrs. Carson exchanged glances. I brought something, Caroline continued, opening her small handbag. She withdrew a handkerchief wrapped around something small. My grandmother's brooch. For luck. Margaret recognized the silver pin shaped like twisted branches that Caroline had described at their last brief meeting in town. It's beautiful, she breathed. But I couldn't. Please, Caroline interrupted, voice stronger than Margaret had ever heard it. When you stood up to Edward at the harvest dance, something changed for me. I began to see possibilities I'd never considered. She pinned the brooch to Margaret's bodice with trembling fingers. This isn't just a wedding gift. It's a thank you. Outside, the fiddle began to play, signaling it was time. Caroline squeezed Margaret's hand once before slipping away to find a seat among the guests. Mrs. Carson adjusted Margaret's veil one last time. Ready to become Mrs. Blackwood? Margaret nodded, a sudden calm replacing her earlier nerves. More ready than I've been for anything in my life. The barn doors stood wide open to the spring day, framing James as he waited beneath an arch of early wildflowers and green branches. His face when he saw Margaret walking toward him, pride and joy and wonder all mixed together, was worth every whisper, every struggle, every mile that had brought her to this moment. Pastor Evans, who'd ridden 2 days from the nearest town with a church, cleared his throat as Margaret took her place beside James. "Friends and neighbors," he began, voice carrying to the rafters where barn swallows nested. "We gather today to witness the union of two souls who found each other through circumstances some might call unusual." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. Margaret caught sight of several of the ranch hands nodding, remembering the day she'd first ridden out with them, determined to prove herself. "But God's ways are not our ways," the pastor continued, "and He brings people together through paths we cannot always understand at first glance." As they spoke their vows, James's hands held her steady and sure, the same hands that had taught her to throw a lasso, that had worked beside hers through seasons of drought and plenty. His voice never wavered as he promised to cherish her strength as well as her tenderness, to walk beside her rather than before or behind. When Margaret's turn came, she spoke clearly enough for even those standing at the back to hear. "I promise to be your partner in all things, to face whatever comes with the same courage we've faced everything so far. I promise to remember always that true strength lies not in never needing help, but in knowing when to give it and when to accept it." Rays of sunlight streamed through the barn doors, catching dust motes and turning them to gold as James slipped a second ring, this one new and shining, onto her finger to join his mother's band. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, James's kiss held the promise of all the days to come. The celebration spilled from the barn into the ranch yard, where tables groaned with food prepared by every woman within 20 miles. Fiddle music sparked dancing that grew livelier as the sun began its slow descent toward the mountains. Margaret found herself pulled into conversation after conversation. Advice from older ranch wives delivered with knowing smiles, congratulations from men who'd once doubted a woman could do what she'd done, shy questions from young girls about what it was like to ride astride. Cooper, the oldest of the ranch hands, raised a toast that brought tears to Margaret's eyes. "To the boss and his missus, the strongest team in Montana territory." As twilight softened the landscape, Margaret slipped away from the noise and laughter, seeking a moment of quiet. She found herself by the corral where the chestnut colt, now nearly grown, whickered a greeting. Behind her, familiar footsteps approached. "Hiding from our guests, Mrs. Blackwood?" James asked, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Just catching my breath," she replied, leaning back against his chest. "And getting used to my new name. Do you like it?" "I like what it represents," she said, turning to face him. "A choice freely made, a partnership freely entered." The sunset painted the mountains purple and gold beyond them, the land they would shape together stretching out in all directions. "I have a wedding gift for you," James said, taking her hand. "Come see." He led her past the celebration, toward a hillock that overlooked the ranch. As they crested the rise, Margaret stopped short, her free hand flying to her mouth. There, nestled among young pine trees, stood a small cabin, windows glowing with lamplight. How did you?" James laughed at her astonishment. "The men and I have been working on it since winter broke. Thought you might like a place of our own, separate from the main house." "It's perfect," she whispered, taking in the porch with its 2 rocking chairs, the chimney promising warmth on cold nights, the flower beds already planted along the walkway. "There's more," he said, guiding her toward the door. "But you have to close your eyes." Margaret obeyed, letting him lead her up the steps and through the door. The scent of new wood and something else, something familiar yet unexpected, filled her nose. "Now look," James said, his voice warm with anticipation. She opened her eyes to find herself in a cozy main room with a stone fireplace. But what made her gasp was the bookcase built into one wall, shelves already half filled with volumes whose spines she recognized immediately. "My books," she breathed, crossing to run her fingers along the familiar leather bindings. "From Pennsylvania." "How?" "Your father sent them," James replied, watching her face. "I wrote to him 2 months ago, telling him about our engagement. Asked if there was anything of yours he might want to send as a wedding gift." Margaret turned to stare at him, emotions tangling in her chest. You wrote to my father? The man who thought no husband would want a strong-willed wife. James nodded. His reply came 3 weeks later with 4 crates of books. Said they were always more yours than his. Said he was glad you'd found. He pulled a folded letter from his pocket and read, "A man smart enough to appreciate the worth of a woman who knows her own mind." Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks as she took the letter, recognizing her father's cramped handwriting. Since leaving Pennsylvania, she'd written him monthly, describing her new life. His replies had been brief but consistent. Never once had he suggested she return east. "There's one more thing," James said, producing a small package wrapped in brown paper. This came with the books. Inside, Margaret found a daguerreotype in a simple frame. Her mother at about Margaret's age, standing proudly beside a plow, shoulders straight and strong, eyes bright with determination. "He wrote that she was the strongest woman he ever knew," James said softly. "Said you reminded him of her more each year." Margaret traced her mother's face with a gentle finger. The resemblance was startling. The same broad shoulders, the same steadfast expression. "I never knew," she whispered. "He never showed me this." "He said it was time you had it," James replied. "Time you knew where your strength came from." From the distance came the sounds of their wedding celebration. Laughter, music, the occasional whoop as dancing grew more spirited with the night. But here in their new home, Margaret and James stood in a moment that belonged just to them, a bridge between past and future. "Welcome home, Margaret Blackwood," James said, drawing her close. As his lips found hers, Margaret knew that what had begun as a journey of rejection had led to the truest acceptance she could have imagined. Not just from the man who held her, but from a community, a way of life, and perhaps most surprising of all, from the father who had finally found words to express his pride in the daughter who had never fit the mold. Thunder rolled across the valley, rattling window panes in the small schoolhouse where Margaret Blackwood stood before 20 children of various ages. 10 years had etched fine lines around her eyes and threaded silver through her dark hair, but her back remained straight as a lodgepole pine as she moved among the desks, checking arithmetic problems. "Mrs. Blackwood," 8-year-old Billy Thompson called out, waving his slate. "I finished. Can I help the little ones now?" "May I help?" Margaret corrected gently. "Yes, go assist Sarah with her numbers. Remember, patience is as important as knowledge when teaching others." Outside, rain began to drum against the roof, a spring downpour washing winter's last traces from the land. Margaret glanced at the clock hanging beside the American flag. Half an hour until dismissal, not enough time for the storm to pass. Parents would arrive with blankets and slickers, transforming the schoolyard into a sea of hurried reunions. Teaching had not been part of Margaret's plan when she'd first arrived in Montana Territory. But 3 years ago, when the town schoolteacher had suddenly eloped with a cattle buyer from Wyoming, Margaret had stepped in, just until a replacement arrives. The replacement never came, and to everyone's surprise, especially her own, Margaret discovered she had a gift for imparting knowledge. 3 days each week, she rode from the Blackwood Ranch to the one-room schoolhouse, leaving ranch operations in James's capable hands. The other 4 days, she worked alongside him as she always had, their partnership the talk of the territory. Some called it scandalous still. Others called it the secret to the Blackwood Ranch's growing prosperity. "Children," Margaret called over the increasing rumble of thunder, "put away your slates and gather your things. The storm's coming faster than I expected." As the students scrambled to collect books and lunch pails, the schoolhouse door burst open. Elizabeth Blackwood, 9 years old and vibrant as a wildflower, rushed in with her younger brother Thomas close behind. Both children were soaked to the skin, dark hair plastered to their heads. "Mama!" Elizabeth called, excitement overriding her usual school decorum. "Papa sent us with the wagon. The creek's rising, and he says to bring everyone to our house until the storm passes." Margaret's heart swelled at her daughter's unconscious pride. Elizabeth never doubted her place in the world, never hesitated to speak her mind. She'd been born to the freedom Margaret had fought to claim. "Listen, everyone," Margaret said, clapping her hands for attention. "Change of plans. We're all going to the Blackwood Ranch until your parents can safely collect you. Cheers erupted from the children, who knew well the cookies Mrs. Peterson, the ranch cook, always had ready for visitors. Even now, 10 years after James and Margaret's wedding, the Blackwood Ranch remained a gathering place, its reputation for hospitality as well known as its prize cattle. The next hour passed in organized chaos as Margaret loaded 20 excited children into the covered wagon James had sent. With Thomas helping the smallest ones and Elizabeth organizing seating with the authority of a general, they set off through sheets of rain toward the ranch house visible on the distant hill. By the time they arrived, the ranch yard had become a small lake, rivulets of water carving channels through mud. James waited on the porch, face breaking into a wide grin at the sight of the wagon packed with soggy, chattering children. "Quite a catch today, Mrs. Blackwood," he called, splashing through puddles to help unload his unusual cargo. "The best kind," she replied, passing down a tiny first grader. "Though I fear Mrs. Peterson might have something to say about 20 pairs of muddy boots." "Mrs. Peterson has been baking since the clouds gathered," James assured her, lifting Thomas from the wagon. "She claims she always knows when company's coming." Inside, the children found places by the fire, shedding wet coats and boots as ranch hands arrived with towels and blankets. Margaret moved among them, checking for chills, assigning dry socks from the basket kept for such emergencies. Through it all, she caught glimpses of James doing the same. This cattle baron who had once shocked the territory by marrying a mail-order bride rejected for being too muscular now kneeling to tie a small girl's shoe. As the afternoon progressed, parents began to arrive, drawn by the network of ranch connections that spread news faster than telegraph wires. Each expressed gratitude as they collected children who regaled them with tales of adventure and Mrs. Peterson's ginger cookies. By dusk, only 3 children remained, those who lived too far for safe travel in the continuing storm. James had already arranged sleeping places. His matter-of-fact kindness, one of the countless reasons Margaret's love, had only deepened over their years together. After dinner, as rain continued its steady percussion on the roof, the family gathered in the study that had once been Edward Thornhill's. The room had transformed over the years, hunting trophies replaced by children's drawings, heavy drapes exchanged for lighter curtains that welcomed morning light. On the wall beside James's desk hung a framed newspaper article from 5 years prior, headlined, "Blackwood Ranch Innovations Lead Territory in Cattle Breeding." Thomas, now 8 and serious as his father had ever been, spread school papers across the carpet. Elizabeth curled in the window seat with one of Margaret's old books, occasionally reading passages aloud that caught her imagination. The 3 remaining students had been absorbed into evening routines as if they belonged there, which, in the way of rural communities, they did. As she knitted by lamplight, Margaret observed her family with quiet wonder. These moments, ordinary yet precious, were built on foundations she couldn't have imagined when she'd stepped off that train, trunk heavy with hopes that had seemed broken beyond repair after Edward Thornhill's rejection. A knock at the front door interrupted her thoughts. James rose to answer, returning moments later with a rain-drenched woman barely recognizable under her dripping cloak. "Caroline," Margaret said, setting aside her knitting in astonishment. "Caroline Thornhill?" Caroline lowered her hood, revealing a face thinner than Margaret remembered, dark circles shadowing eyes that held a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "I've left Edward," she said simply. "I remembered what you said at your wedding, about having a choice." Margaret exchanged a glance with James, who nodded almost imperceptibly before gathering the children. "Young folks, let's give your mother and Mrs. Thornhill some privacy. I believe Mrs. Peterson mentioned something about apple tarts for those who finished their studies." When they were alone, Margaret guided Caroline to the fire, helping her remove the sodden cloak. "Tell me," she said, pressing a warm cup of tea into the woman's trembling hands. Caroline's story emerged in halting fragments. Years of isolation as Edward's business ventures grew. His increasing control over every aspect of her life. The final straw. His decision to send her back east to her family after she'd failed, yet again, to produce an heir. "I realized I'd spent 10 years trying to make myself smaller," Caroline said, staring into the fire. Quieter, less needy, less myself. Then last week I saw Elizabeth in town, directing those ranch hands loading supplies like a general with her troops. A small smile touched her lips, just like her mother, and I thought, that's what strength looks like. That's what I want to feel before I die. Margaret reached for her hand. You already have that strength, Caroline. You're here, aren't you? I have nowhere to go, Caroline admitted, shame coloring her voice. My family won't welcome me without Edward's blessing. I have no skills, no means to support myself. You have friends, Margaret said firmly. You can stay here until you decide what comes next. When James returned, having settled the children with books and tarts, he listened to Caroline's situation without judgment. We have the cabin, he suggested. It's heated, furnished, and private. Caroline looked between them, confusion evident. The cabin, where we lived before the children came, Margaret explained. Now it's our guest house. It would give you space to think, to plan. I can't impose, Caroline began. You're not imposing, James interrupted gently. You're accepting help from friends. Sometimes the strongest thing we can do is let others support us while we find our footing. Later that night, after Caroline had been settled in the cabin with food and clean clothes, Margaret and James stood on their porch watching the storm finally move eastward, stars emerging in its wake like silver dollars scattered across black velvet. Do you ever wonder, James asked, his arm around her waist, what might have happened if Edward Thornhill hadn't been such a fool that day you arrived? Margaret considered the question, looking toward the cabin where a single lamp still burned. I used to think it was bad fortune, she replied slowly. Now I understand it was the finest stroke of luck I could have had. Had he accepted me, I might have ended up like Caroline, trying to make myself smaller, less capable, less myself. James nodded, understanding as he always did. And I might never have found the one person strong enough to build this life with me. In the distance, an owl called, its voice carrying across land that had become as much a part of Margaret as her own heartbeat. The Blackwood Ranch had grown beyond what either of them had imagined, not just in acres or cattle, but in purpose. A place where strength was valued rather than feared, where children grew up believing they could forge their own paths, where even now, a woman who had spent years diminishing herself might finally learn to claim her rightful space in the world. As they turned to go inside, Margaret paused in the doorway, looking back at the star-filled sky. 10 years ago, she'd stepped off a train into rejection that had felt like the end of all her hopes. Instead, it had been the beginning of something far greater than she could have dreamed. Not just love or success, but the creation of a legacy built on the simple, revolutionary belief that true worth isn't measured by conformity to others' expectations, but by the courage to be authentically oneself. And that was a lesson worth passing on, not just to their children, but to anyone who found their way to their door.